Hello, and welcome to the Alternate History Class podcast. My name's Andrew, and here I explore alternate history through the lens of a history class from another timeline. Last week, we took a brief break in advancing the timeline to look at how Black culture developed in the Confederacy. This week, we will start advancing that timeline again as we look at how the Great War started and what each major nation wanted out of the conflict. All right, everyone, let's pick things back up. Today we will start our look at the Great War, and we'll begin with the U.S. officially joining the Central Powers. This was something that they came to an agreement with Germany and Austria-Hungary during 1913. And they made the agreement to become official on January 1st of the next year. And so the announcement was made. Now, many expected this to push the Confederacy into the arms of the Triple Alliance, to make it the Quadruple Alliance. The Confederacy did not. What you need to remember is Woodrow Wilson was very much a pacifist. He did not want to get involved in war, especially wars in Europe. He had this ideal of a world where nations would settle their differences at the diplomatic table. Something that the world, especially at that point in time, was not ready for. So our next major point is that on June 28th of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was visiting Sarajevo in the newly acquired territory of Bosnia, trying to do a goodwill kind of tour. But a Serbian-backed terrorist named Gavrilo Princip would assassinate the Archduke and his wife on that day. This would lead to what was called the July Crisis, as the diplomatic powers of Europe would maneuver to try to see if they could either avoid war or get a war that was more beneficial to them. Austria-Hungary was looking for German backing if things did escalate to war, because they knew that if they went to war with Serbia, it was extremely likely that the Russians, who had signed a defense pact with the Serbians, would join the war as well. And Austria-Hungary, for all its lack of competency, acknowledged that it could not fight a two-front war, especially with a nation as large as Russia. And so, as they waited for German backing, they prepared a list of demands that they sent on July 26th to the Serbian government. It denounced the actions and denounced a lot of the rhetoric that had been put out by the Serbian government, whether officially or through textbooks and the like, and blamed it for the cause of the assassination. They sent 10 points that they demanded Serbia agree all to. They included suppressing all publications which, quote, incited hatred and contempt of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, end quote, and, quote, are directed against its territorial integrity, end quote. They also demanded the dissolution of nationalist organizations in Serbia, such as a group known in English as the People's Defense. They also demanded eliminating, without delay from school books and public documents, what they called propaganda against Austria-Hungary. They demanded the removal from the Serbian military and civil administrations anyone who the Austro-Hungarian government demanded as having ties to the assassination. They also demanded that Serbia accept representatives from Austria-Hungary to help with the suppression of subversive movements against Austria-Hungary. They demanded that all accessories to the Archduke's assassination be brought to trial and to allow Austro-Hungarian law enforcement officers to take part in the investigation as well, to ensure that the Serbian government wasn't attempting to cover up their role in the assassination, as the Austro-Hungarians figured that they had, even though they had no solid evidence at the time. In specific, they asked for the arrest of Major Vojislav Dankosik and a civil servant named Milan Siganovic, who were named as participants in the assassination plot. They demanded that the Serbians cease cooperating in trafficking arms and explosives across the border between the two countries, and for the Serbians to dismiss and punish the officials of Sabak and Loznica Frontier Service for assisting in the assassination by allowing these arms to get into Bosnia. They also demanded that the Serbians provide explanations to Austro-Hungarian government officials regarding what they called Serbian officials who have expressed themselves in interviews in terms of hostility to the Austro-Hungarian government. And finally, they wanted the Serbians to notify them without delay the execution of the previously mentioned measures in the ultimatum. Now, Serbia refused to accept all these demands, specifically the ones that allowed Austria-Hungary to suppress subversive elements inside Serbia, anti-Austro-Hungarian elements within Serbia, and the one that allowed them to take part in the investigation and the trial of Serbians linked to the assassination. With this refusal, which came just at the deadline on July 25th, Serbia also began to mobilize because they suspected that Austria-Hungary would declare war, which they did 3 days later when they also began bombing and artillery attacks on the country. This activated Serbia's defensive alliance with Russia. So Russia began to mobilize to join the war and back Serbia on July 30th. The next day, Germany, to back Austria-Hungary, also began its mobilization. But in an attempt to de-escalate the war, gave demands of France and Russia to stand down. Now, they weren't expecting the French and the Russians to back down, but the effort was put in there. This was given 12 hours for France and Russia to stand down. And when they did not, by the next day, August 1st, Germany was officially at war with France and Russia and began with the occupation of Luxembourg. Now, the Germans had a plan called the Schlieffen Plan, in which they had the goal of attacking France quickly through the lowlands because they knew that France and Russia would join each other in war. And Germany would have to fight a two-front war against them. So this plan, the Schlieffen Plan, called for the Germans to attack France quickly through the lowlands, as Russia was expected to take a long time to mobilize. The goal was to quickly knock France out of the war and then turn and put the focus on Russia. Now, some of you may think that seems familiar, and in many ways it is very similar to what the American war plan was. But we will discuss the Custer Plan when we dive more into the North American front of the war next week. So when they occupied Luxembourg on August 2nd, they were unable to engage French forces on a less fortified part of the border between the two countries because the French had built up a strong defensive line with Germany, especially after the humiliation that was the Franco-Prussian War. On August 3rd, Belgium refused the German request to pass through their lands to attack France. Germany had been looking to get Belgium's permission, in part to respect Belgium's neutrality, but also, more importantly, to attempt to keep the United Kingdom out of the war. But with this refusal, the Germans invaded Belgium, and the UK joined the war, technically at midnight on August 5th, but they were essentially in the war from the moment the Germans began to invade Belgium. The U.S. would join the war the day after the United Kingdom did in support of its allies. A week later, under immense public pressure and pressure from the Confederate Congress and Senate, Woodrow Wilson would ask for a declaration of war himself and receive it. They officially would join on August 12th. Meanwhile, the Japanese would join on their side of their long-time allies, the United Kingdom, on the side of the Entente. The Ottomans would join with a Black Sea raid against Russia on August 29th on the side of the Central Powers. And now, before we go any further, we're going to take a look at what each nation wanted out of the war. Now, for the Central Powers, it's much easier for us to know due to the outcome of the war. Some of these are based on public statements by the Entente members. Some of these are based off of official documents and plans that were obtained. And some of them are, speculation, because we don't fully know what each nation would really want out of this war, because half of them lost. So let's start with our North American nations. The United States had the goals of taking Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Sequoia away from the Confederacy, to take Bahama, Bermuda, Jamaica, and Belize from the United Kingdom, as well as to occupy Canada. And at the end of this, they would also want war reparations from the Confederacy in an effort to make them more reliant on the U.S. for trade, and to try to solidify the U.S.'s position as the military and financial power in the Western Hemisphere. The Confederacy, as we know, as we said, these are largely speculative, but they're based off of statements from high-ranking members later in the war, and would be respective of what the Confederate government would likely declare for if they had won the war. They wanted to take Allegheny and reunite it with Maryland. They wanted to take West Virginia and reunite it with Virginia. And they wanted Delaware as well. They also would have likely wanted war reparations from the United States. Now let's take a look at the Central Powers. While Germany didn't have an outright goal claim when the war started, by September they had an outline of what they wanted from this war. And they called it the September Program. Their first point was to demand that France cede some of its northern territory, such as the iron ore mines in Bray and coastal strip running between Dunkirk and Boulogne-sur-Mer, to Belgium or Germany. They wanted reparations to the tune of 10 billion German marks from France, with further payments to cover veterans' funds and to pay off all of Germany's existing national debt. They wanted France to partially disarm by demolishing its northern forts. They wanted Belgium to become a vassal state of Germany. They either wanted that or an annexation, but they preferred Belgium become a vassal state, which would cede its eastern parts and Antwerp to Germany, while also giving Germany military and naval bases. They wanted Luxembourg to become a member state of the German Empire. They wanted buffer states to be created between them and Russia. These buffer states would be carved out of Russia and would include nations such as Poland, which would be a German puppet, as would all of these buffer states. Germany would also create what it called the Mitteleuropa Economic Association, which members would include France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Austria-Hungary, the buffer states carved out of Russia, and potentially even Italy, Sweden, and Norway. The German possessions in Africa would be enlarged at the expense of the French and Belgian colonies in the area to create a contiguous German colony, which they would call Mittel Africa, across the whole of Central Africa. They did not make any plans at the time for British colonies to be taken, but they did demand that Britain's quote-unquote intolerable hegemony was to end in global affairs. And the final part of this plan was that the Netherlands would be brought into a closer relationship to Germany while avoiding any appearance of coercion. So this wouldn't be something that would necessarily be in the treaty itself, but it would be a large part of what German foreign policy would be going forward to try to help solidify their continental hold. When the war began, Austria-Hungary really had two goals, both of which they had to compromise on when Bulgaria joined the Central Powers. Their primary goals were to annex the whole of Serbia, which would be amended to just be the northern portion of Serbia. And they also wanted Montenegro, which they also would have to back down on as at this point in time really a minor partner of the alliance of the Central Powers. The final major member as of 1914 in the Central Powers was the Ottoman Empire. They had goals to establish themselves as the hegemon of power in the Middle East. They wanted to stabilize and industrialize their nation and wanted to, if the opportunity presented itself during the war, which if they won, it likely would, expand their influence and power in the Caucasus and to take Egypt back from the United Kingdom, something they viewed as having been swiped out from under them. Now, when it comes to the Entente, or the Triple Alliance, the United Kingdom seemed to have two primary goals. It was to crush German military hegemony in Europe. The British were the dominant naval power in the world at the time, and had always had rivals on the continent, whether it be Napoleon or now the Prussians. They always were looking to stop and limit the power of any one continental nation's military might, and would ally with different sides to do so. At this point in time, they were much more concerned about Germany. And so if they could crush German military hegemony in Europe, that would be a major victory for the United Kingdom. They also wanted to take Germany's African colonies. They likely would have wanted to take more if other alliance members hadn't been in the war, such as Japan. France wanted to retake Alsace-Lorraine, which they had lost back in the Franco-Prussian War. And they also wanted to not just crush the German military hegemony on the continent, but to become the military hegemon of the continent. Russia's primary goal was to take full control in the Balkans, make it its backyard, make it its sphere of influence. Japan, its goals are in many ways a lot clearer than a lot of the European members of the Entente. They wanted to take the German and American colonies in the Pacific and East Asian regions, just to expand their power in East Asia, to become the hegemon of power in that region. Now, there would be 4 nations that would be considered major players in the war, who would join later. Italy, who was originally a member of the Central Powers, would betray and stab the Central Powers in the back in 1915 due to not liking the nature of how the war started and receiving better offers of land from France and the United Kingdom if they joined the Entente than what the Central Powers apparently offered. So their goal was to gain these traditionally Italian lands that were held by Austria-Hungary in the Balkans and Alpine regions. Bulgaria would also join in 1915 on the side of the Central Powers, in some ways to counterbalance Italy joining the war. Their goal and what they were promised were southern Serbia as well as Montenegro, and to become the recognized power in the southern Balkans. To become really the southern Slavic power. The next major power to join the war late was China. After Japan was infamously known as the 21 Demands, the Chinese would refuse those demands, as they included giving up Chinese lands and Chinese mining rights and Chinese factories and control over large parts of China, not nominally, but economically. So they joined more out of a self-defense from Japan, who declared war on China, declaring it an essential, declaring what it did as an essential part of the war goal for the Entente. China also, when talking with the other Central Powers to formally join, got assurances that they would retake holdings that the Entente had carved out for themselves in China, as well as, if given the opportunity, to take Korea away from the Japanese, whether that be as a puppet, which was their preferred method, or just straight up annexing the territory. And the final power, which is based on their war performance, kind of a iffy if they are a major power or not, is Romania, who wanted to take advantage of Bulgaria's actions in Serbia and Montenegro to try to do it was essentially a quick land grab and to crush the power that the Bulgarians had in the region, as well as grabbing land that had high Romanian populations in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, next week, we will dive in and focus in on how the war developed in North America. After doing that, we will briefly summarize how the war shook out in the rest of the world, Africa, in Europe, where the primary part of the fighting was, and in East Asia. And then we would look at how the Treaty of Berlin would shape the coming decades and lead to the World War.